So what is going on, everybody? Fernando Silva here with another video, and welcome to Apple Spring Event Week. We're covering everything that Apple's announced and what it's going to mean for the company moving forward. But today what I want to talk about is that new M1 iPad Air and the Studio display that comes built with that A13 chip right in it. And I want to talk about what that means for the iPad Pro lineup moving forward, because I think we're finally going to get that dream iPad situation where we're going to have extended monitor support, floating windows, and maybe something brand new with iPadOS 16. So without further ado, let me explain to you guys why I think we're finally going to get that dream scenario that we've been wanting since I think iPadOS 13 and Apple releasing that 2018 iPad Pro. But without further ado, let's talk about it. So firstly, let's talk about that M1 iPad Air and how it stacks up in the current iPad lineup with the M1 iPad Pros and the iPad Mini. So let's see what you get for $600, which is the baseline price for the M1 iPad Air. So what you get upgraded is obviously, I think it was the A13 or A14 that was in the iPad Air previously in the iPad Air 4, so that gets upgraded to the M1. So that M1 is the same chip that's in the iPad Pros, in the M1 MacBook Airs, and the M1 MacBook Pros. You also get the new 12 megapixel selfie camera. I'm calling it new like this because it's been in the iPad Pros, it just came to the iPad Mini, and it's even in the iPad 9 generation, but you do get that 12 megapixel selfie camera with center stage, and it's an ultra wide. So love that addition. It's a long time coming. It just needed to get that upgrade in order to fit correctly inside of that lineup. And then on top of that, we got an upgraded USB-C port. So it's still a USB-C port. It is not a Thunderbolt 4 port. It is a USB-C port, and it's going to transfer speeds up to 2x times as fast as it did previously. So that's always a welcome addition, but just keep in mind that it is still USB-C and not a Thunderbolt, so you will be transferring with USB-C speeds. And again, the Thunderbolt, it was nice on the iPad Pro, but again, for my personal use case, I haven't really taken full advantage of it because I don't really transfer files that are that large, and I also don't use wired internet connection. So having like a 10 gigabit Thunderbolt cable plugged in or adapter into hardwired internet just doesn't really make sense for me. So again, it does come with USB-C, it's just twice as fast now with data transfer speeds, and of course, it still pushes audio and video. And then lastly, it is 5G capable. So that's still a $200 add-on on top of that $600, so it's not part of the baseline price. But again, it is capable, and just know that they do have the ability to add 5G for $200 to any variant of the iPad Air. And now let's compare that to the current lineup of iPad Pros. And we're going to compare it to the 11-inch just because the form factor is a lot more similar. So for the 11-inch iPad Pro starts at $800. The first upgrade that you see is that the base storage on the iPad Pro is 128 gigs versus 64 on that $600 model of the iPad Air, or the M1 iPad Air. 64 gigs is really, I don't think is enough in 2022. I was hoping Apple would go with 128, but again, you do get that 128 base for $800 on the iPad Pro. You also get ProMotion on the 11-inch iPad Pro, so you get that 120 Hz ProMotion, which is beautiful. It doesn't have mini LED like the 12.9-inch iPad Pro, but you will be getting that ProMotion 120 Hz versus the regular 60 Hz on the iPad Air. And then you also get a Thunderbolt port versus a USB-C port like I mentioned, but again, I don't use a Thunderbolt port to its full capacity, so if you are somebody that uses a Thunderbolt 4 port, you know who you are and you know that that is a need for you. And then also with the iPad Pros, you get the different camera sensors on the back. You get the two 12 megapixel cameras, the wide and the ultra wide, and then you also get a LiDAR scanner on the back, which again, very, very, very rarely used on my end on both the 11-inch and the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. I only use the rear camera to scan documents, if that, and the LiDAR scanner has, aside from demoing it like the first day that I got it, I have not used it at all. So now we're put in the situation where $750 gets you a 256 gigabyte M1 iPad Air, or another $50 gets you a 128 gigabyte 11-inch iPad Pro. So that bears the question, like, which one is worth it? Is it worth to go with the iPad Air? Is it worth to go with the 11-inch iPad Pro? The question is, what gives, right? Like, why would anybody go with a older 11-inch iPad Pro versus a brand new M1, fully loaded, minus 5G, fully loaded M1 iPad Air? Who would go with a Pro versus the Air today? But before we actually answer that question, and bear with me because this is all gonna make sense at the very end and talk about Apple's grand scheme, right? But before we answer the question of why anyone would pick up the M1 iPad Pro versus the M1 iPad Air, let's talk about the Studio display, because the Studio display was actually very, very interesting, and one of the features kind of went under the radar. So yes, it's a great display, right? It's got that 14.7 million pixels, 5K display, 218 ppi, so it's gonna be very, very crisp. It looks almost bezel-less. It's a very beautiful design. It's got the 6-speaker system, which is brand new. It's got the new mic array. It's got a built-in 12 megapixel selfie camera with that ultra wide and center stage. So it's bringing all that stuff that we love from the Retina displays on all other Apple devices and bringing it into a nice monitor form factor that's a little bit more affordable. I mean, it's still $1,600, but it's not $5,000 like the Pro Display XDR. Oh, and it comes included with a stand. No need to spend an extra $1,000 for a stand for your $5,000 monitor. But the one thing that nobody's really talking about is the fact that this studio display has an A13 Apple Silicon in it. Now keep in mind that A13 powered the latest and greatest iPhone back 2 years ago. So the 11 Pro Max ran on that A13, right? I think the 9th generation still runs on the A13 and the iPad. You know, we had the iPad Air running on the A14. Before that, we had the A12Z and the A12X running on the iPad Pros before they turned into the M1 iPad Pros. So these Apple Silicon chipsets are more than just like a T1 chip or a U1 chip that are made for connectivity. These are chips that run operating systems, right? These are chips that run entire computers in the palm of your hand. So having the A13 in a studio monitor, right, in a studio display where there's no actual computer behind this monitor is kind of interesting. So Apple putting that A13 in the studio display is something to keep in mind as we move forward with this video and as we move forward with these iPad Pros. And then another interesting thing about the studio display is that if you go to Apple's website and go to the spec sheet of these displays, there's a section in the compatibility, because Apple always mentions what these devices are going to be compatible with in the Apple ecosystem. So it lets us know that, hey, the 12.9-inch M1 iPad Pro, the 11-inch M1 iPad Pro, and now the M1 iPad Air are going to be compatible with this new studio display as long as it's running 15.4 or higher in terms of iPadOS. But then if you go to the XDR, so the Pro Display XDR, it's a $5,000 monitor. If you go to that same spec sheet and look at the compatibility section, all iPads are completely omitted from there. But the iPad Pro, the M1 iPad Pro, still works with a Thunderbolt cable on that Pro Display XDR. It just has that really annoying mirror display with the black bar, so it's not a pretty setup, but it does physically work with that XDR display. So now if we come over again to that new studio display, Apple, first off, having the A13 chip in there and then telling us in the spec sheet that it's compatible with certain iPads that have 15.4 and higher and have an M1 chip. Again, very interesting to see why Apple would put that on there. Like, Apple does things with purpose. So I think there is a purpose behind this compatibility feature with a studio display. So basically what I'm saying is that in the fall, because now we're on the 18-month trajectory of iPad Pros being released, Apple has finally caught up the rest of the iPad lineup to the iPad Pro, so now it's time for the iPad Pro to get an update from both an internal spec and maybe even a little bit of hardware or form factor change. But again, basically what I'm saying is that in the fall, with the new iPad Pros alongside iPadOS 16, I think we're going to finally have our situation where we can finally extend the display and have a real professional multitasking situation with floating windows with an M1 powered iPad, whether it's a Pro or the Air. And now, why do I think that? And again, it goes back to that A13 chip being put into the monitor. Because that A13 chip, for all intents and purposes, is a computer. So being able to have a compute power inside of a monitor is going to be something that's new, it's different, it's something that Apple's going to utilize moving forward. So my inference is that with these new iPadOS 16 iPads that come out, the M1 iPads in the fall, I think we're going to be able to plug in an iPad into this display, and then the M1 chip and the A13 chip in the studio display are going to kind of like link up virtually to help power a new experience, kind of like a Samsung Deck situation, but on these M1 iPads, which would be something absolutely amazing. And another reason why I think this could be feasible is because, again, this is a $1,600 display. Like, yes, it's a lot cheaper than Apple's $5,000 display, but you can still go out and buy a $200 display. So first off, not a lot of people are lining up, unless you're a tech YouTuber, to get this display first off, and even less people are lining up to get this display for an iPad in general. So there's going to be a very small sample size or test sample that Apple's going to be able to use to say, hey, if you have an iPad and you have a studio display, then you can actually plug it in and get this new experience. So that's going to allow Apple to take a small test sample size and perform some nice quality control on that, instead of having it just to every single iPad in the masses all over the world, right? That's going to be a headache from a control standpoint and making sure that it's working functionally and working with a purpose. So having this small sample set of users that have this $1,600 monitor and an $1,100 iPad, and then being able to use them in a new way together, Apple's going to be able to control that process and the quality of that process much more closely, because again, the sample of users is going to be much smaller than having every single iPad from one day to the next being able to use an extended display. So basically what I'm saying is that A13 is going to supplement the M1 inside of the M1 iPads to help bring a new experience when connecting to an external monitor. And that's when I think we're going to get that dream iPad situation of being able to use the iPad as our only computer and no need to kind of use these clamshell laptops as that extra 5% of stuff that I can't get done because of extended monitor support. So in conclusion, I think that Apple's finally going to give us the experience that we want with iPadOS 16. I mean, they have to, because from a competition standpoint, you know, Samsung is catching up from both a hardware and software perspective. They have Samsung Decks. Apple's been in the same form factor and same type of iPadOS software since 2018. So Apple's got to change it up a little bit to, again, set themselves apart from the rest of the competition. And I'm excited to see what they do with this new studio display and the iPad Pros moving forward in the fall. Very excited to see what Apple has going on, and it's giving me a nice little sense of hope. I was thinking that Apple kind of forgot about the iPad Pro because they were doing everything with all the other iPads, but now I think Apple has a master plan and we're going to enjoy it. But that's what I'm going to do for this video. Leave a comment down below. Would you pick up a $1,600 accessory for your iPad Pro if it meant that you could use it as a real computer and as a real extended display? A lot of people are going to say no. I'm probably somebody that's going to say yes to that situation, even though I probably won't even want to, but I have to try it out just to see exactly what Apple's going to do with these studio displays and the iPad Pros. But that's what I'm going to do for this video. Leave a comment down below. Would you try something like this? Are you willing to spend the $1,600? Are you excited for any other products during the spring event? Always excited to kind of talk down there in the comments with you guys. But leave a little dolphin if you guys made it to the end. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. And until next time, this is my third time doing this recording because my audio has been all over the place. But we'll talk later, guys. Until next time.